Opposing Gloves here, and today we're going to be talking about parallel motion. So students learn sometimes just, I don't know, this is a trouble spot for a lot of people. So we're just going to set things straight and make it as simple as possible. I actually have a checklist I go through because there's only really 3 things we're really looking for. And I go through these things, and at the end, if I don't find, there's ways of skipping around. Like if I don't find the first one, well, then obviously I'm not going to find the other ones. So there's a way of thinking about it that I'm going to show you. Okay. And there's also, I have this worksheet. It's available in the description for free. So it's under the theory workbook. And yeah, it has a thing that says, oh, do you want to give me money? You know, I appreciate every penny, but it is totally free. You can just put in $0 and obtain it. So, okay, parallel motion. We talked about parallel motion in the previous. It's when 2 parts move in the same direction by the same interval. And we also said, you know, if one's a minor third and one's a major third, and they both go up by a third, you know, that's fine. It's still parallel because they go up by thirds. It depends on the context it's in. So if I played like a parallel thirds, it would sound something like this. There's a classic example of parallel thirds. And everybody going, well, that doesn't sound that bad. Well, parallel motion, in order to really understand, you know, why we're talking about it, we have to understand that in tonal harmony, our main goal is to maintain independent parts and sound sophisticated while doing it. So one of the things we have to be aware of is in order for something to sound independent, it can't sound like any of the other parts, right? It's got to sound different. And so there are certain sounds certain intervals that evoke this unification of parts, and it ruins our independence. One of those sounds is the sound of the perfect fifth. Now, this sound has applications. We're not saying this is like an unusable sound. In fact, there's a whole idea about it in 20th or post-tonal harmony, 20th century era music. And there's other cultures that use this sound as part of their basic building blocks. But we're learning tonal harmony and abiding by those rules. So in our vocabulary, this is not a cool sound. This is the sound of fifths. So we don't like that sound. But we do like thirds. Because they're less stable. This sound of this interval is less stable. For this sound is very stable. It's so stable, in fact, that the harmonic overtone series actually, when you hear a note, this is actually in there. The perfect fifth is actually in there. So we're not going to worry about, that, but we do want to worry about the fact that this is too unifying. Our interval is so stable that if we take this stable sound and go to another sound with that same stableness, we lose our independence. Another one is the unison, right? If 2 parts play the exact same part, so if our alto and our soprano, they both play the same part, that's way too unified. Like they're playing the same thing. So we don't like that either. That's not cool. And then the other thing we don't like is octaves. And an octave and a unison, same thing, only one's up an octave. So same notes might as well have played. Now, these do have applications, and we'll learn about them later, but we do not want them in our tonal music. So they are big red flags. Another one that I should bring up, I actually talk about here in this paragraph here, is you will see some instructors really care about parallel fourths. They sound like this. And we notice they have a pretty similar sound to fifths, but not quite the same. And so actually parallel fourths are allowed. They are generally considered poor, but they're allowed. And some instructors don't allow them. And the reason they usually quote, they are inverted fifths. If you invert a fifth, you get a fourth. So here's C to G, or you could use the rule of 9 if you remember that from the previous lessons. So we have C to G, and then we have G to C, which is a fourth. So because of this, some instructors are not cool. I've never taken an instructor who doesn't let you use parallel fourths because that's weird. But maybe you have like a crazy one that at the beginning they give you very strict rules. But for us, we're cool with them. It is generally considered poor though. But if we have to, totally fine. So, okay. So yeah, so we don't like parallel motion because the unification of parts. Also, these sounds are generally considered unsophisticated in this context, or some of them may even go so far as to call it a primal sound. or a bass sound. Like, those are all things people say sometimes when referring to it in the context of tonal harmony. So, all right. This is actually called parallelism, and parallelism is the use of parallel motion, but this is for post-tonal music. So this is music that, will have, so in tonal harmony, we have a tonal center. We could actually use an idea called parallelism to deliberately remove the tonal center, but that's like several courses down the line. But anyways, it's the use of parallel motion. Thought it was relevant to tell you here. And then also, not all unification is bad. So this, when we move in thirds, that's fine unification. We still have a really good sense of what note goes to what part. Because we do not let our voices cross. If our voices cross there, that would be horribly confusing. But we do not let our voices cross, because the top voice obviously has to be one part and the bottom voice has to be the other part. And then we want to avoid the parallel motion that either serves no purpose or conflicts with the harmonic function, which is sort of what I just explained. These sounds they conflict with our harmonic, what a chord will typically do. So there's three kinds of parallel motion. The one I've been describing to you that we don't really like for the reasons of unification, that's called objectionable parallels. Okay, so that it's parallel motion we object to, we don't like it. And then we say there's a second kind called unequal parallels. This is a special case of objectionable parallels. So unequal parallels only really come up in one interval, and that's the fifth. That's the one we're the most concerned with. That's the one that will occur by far the most. And that is when we have a diminished fifth and a perfect fifth following each other. It'll actually happen diatonically, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So unequal parallels, we will talk about, which is basically a special case of objectionable. And it's one of the few times we do consider the exact interval they move by. And then we say direct and hidden parallels, and you'll find out why they're called this when we get to them. All right, so this is just a little spiel here saying some instructors have stricter rules, and I also bring up the fact that, seconds and thirds are less unifying in parallel motion than a fifth or an octave or a unison will be. And then we say, okay, we have objectionable parallels. Let's get to work here, right? Let's see this. All right, so because of these things I've explained up here, we can develop this rule. We do not want any two parts. So here we have four parts, right? We have parts. We don't want any combo of parts, whether it be bass soprano, whether it be alto tenor. We don't want any of them to form a fifth and then move to another fifth. They have to move. If one stays still, it's static and the motion becomes oblique. It's no longer parallel. So then we're cool. But if one starts out in a fifth, so here we have a C and a G. So we say, ooh, this is a perfect fifth. And it's totally cool. At this point, we're cool, right? Because no motion has happened. But then both these voices, they move. And these same two voices, gotta be the same two, form another fifth. And because we go G to D, that's another fifth. And because of this, we say, oh my gosh, we have a perfect fifth. They both move, and the same two voices form another fifth. Not cool anymore. That's perfect fifths. We don't like that. So if we play it, so frowned upon, we have skewed the idea here. And not to mention the fact that we have a rather large leap. So yes, not cool. But we resolve stepwise down in one voice, so I guess that's fine. But right here, this motion violates our deal here. So we don't want that. So there's an example of a perfect fifth. Again, they started a perfect fifth. Both those voices move, and the same two voices that form the perfect fifth form another perfect fifth. Like, that's as clearly as I can say it. It doesn't matter. It could be between these two voices. If they moved and they were at a perfect fifth and they moved to another perfect fifth, not allowed. And now the one that gets a lot of people is when we have soprano and we have tenor forming a fifth, and then they move up to form another fifth. And so, yeah, now there's a way to check for this, right? So if we only care if there's a fifth already. So you just look for where there are fifths. Do you see fifths? And I say, oh, I see a fifth here. Well, okay. Do you see a fifth anywhere else? Well, I say, okay, well, I see the C obviously, if we're working with a C major chord, it's got to be a C and a G. So I have a C. Do I have another G? And I say, oh, I do have another G. It's up there. And this is called an octave equivalent. We care about these. And so we say, okay, well, these are the only ones we care about. Obviously, a fifth can't form anywhere else. So then we check. So we say, okay, well, this C and G, they go up and they form a G and a D. And we say, oh, man, that's a perfect fifth. And now we have a problem. We have to change something. We can't leave it like this. But we also need to check, let's check our outer voices, right? So this one goes to a G. Well, this one goes to a B. That's not a perfect fifth. G to B, that's an octave equivalent of a third. And so we say, oh, okay, that's totally cool. So actually these voices, they're fine. And we're all done checking for parallel fifths and as far as objectionable parallels are concerned. So that's all there is to it. Now here we'd have to change something, and we'll talk about what to change later. But right now we're more focused on spotting them. And so then we say, okay, let's come over here. Let's look at octaves. Now octaves are much easier to check for. You just say, are there doubles of notes running around? And so here we say, okay, well, I've got an E here and I've got an E up here. And we have an issue in that, well, actually, in this case, this is actually a bad example. We don't have an issue. We say between our alto and our bass. Oh, yeah, we do. We have an E here. I'm thinking a bass clef. Whoa, man. Okay, so here we have an E and here we have an E. They go down to a D and another D. So we've got parallel. It started as an octave. Those same two voices moved and they formed another octave. And this one happens across the grand staff. So it's confusing. And you definitely want to make sure you're reading in the right clef. But there you have it. Parallel octaves. They're literally that simple. So if any two parts form an octave or a fifth, you got to check them and make sure that those same two parts don't form the same octave or a fifth. And so they've got to move, and they got to move in the same direction, right? If this one somehow magically moved up to some sort of other E, just saying. If they're going contrary, it's not parallel. They've got to move in the same direction. So if they're going contrary to each other, we're cool again. We're cool. But if it's parallel, it's no longer cool. That's why you'll hear people say, like, oh, contrary motion generally is a good thing. There's actually a spot where it's not a good thing. But generally, it's a good thing. So there you have it. That is objectionable parallels. Hopefully that makes sense to you. And then here's an example of one that is totally good voice leading. We don't have any problems. And we might even go through and check it. We might even go through and say, okay, well, this is a C major chord. We look at it and we say, And we'd also probably have a key or something to help us out. And so we say, okay, we know that if there's going to be fifths, it's got to be between a C and a G. So first we say, where's my G? Here's a G, but a G to a C is a fourth. So we're fine there. So we see here's a C. Well, there's no G above it. So we're good. There's no fifths to watch out for here. But then we say, okay, C to G. Now let's check for octaves. Do I have octaves? Do I have any notes that are octave equivalents? And I say I do. I have a E and I have another E. And so I say, well, that's the only thing we need to check. So we say, okay, we go up here. This one goes to a G, and this one, the bass, soprano goes to a G, bass goes to a D, not octave equivalent. So we're good. This is a good progression. This is fine. We are happy with this. But then we say, okay, well, let's check over here. Now we have D, G, B, G. So that's a G major chord. So we say, G major, the fifth in a G major is G to D. So we look at our G. We say, here's a G. Do we have a D above it? And we say, we don't. There is no D above it. So we are good to go. There can be no fifths that occur here. So you see, it's not that bad. I've seen people just like freak out, but we say, oh, there's no fifths that can occur here. But it is important to be able to recognize your chords. And then we say, all right, do we have an octave equivalent? And I say, oh, I do. I do have an octave equivalent. I have a G here and a G here. But then I say, well, this motion, where do they go? So we say this G stays the same and this G stays the same. And so in this case, it's actually static motion. And so they're not parallel, because this is one part people see this and they go, they stay the same, but what? But remember, this is static motion. It's not parallel. They didn't move, so it's static. So we're fine. totally cool. That's why we like static motion too. Static motion is a cool thing. And so we say, all right, we're done. So this is totally fine. And that's, sounds fine to me. So there we got it. So there's the process going through it. Let's go ahead. Let's look at the next example. You see, don't let a big block of text scare you. I just wanted to be thorough. And so here we have contrary motion. Oh, okay, yeah. So now I said contrary motion, generally a good thing. But octave equivalents are generally not okay. So what does that mean? Well, let's say you've got a parallel fifth here. So here's the same example from before. Here I've got a C to a G. And I say, oh no, that's a fifth. So me being a genius, I say, well, why don't I, before, let's say it's C to G, and this G, let's say it's up here. So I say, I move this C up here. And now we have another fifth. And I go, oh crap, I got to change something. So what do? I do that. By the way, you hit control down to change it by an octave. But it's still a G to a D. It's just separated by an octave, but it's still a C to a G. It's still a fifth. So this is still not okay. Just so you know. Not okay, still a fifth. Actually, this is a less common mistake. I don't see this one as often. Maybe some instructors see it all the time. But usually, for some reason, students seem to get this one. So just so you know, you can't fix things by moving them around by an octave. Octave equivalents are just as bad. If you somehow got the D to be in the bass, then it's a different story because, it's a fourth. But right now, it's a fifth. So not cool at all. So not okay. And so there's that. Tenor bass by contrary, starting G. So this is just explaining what I just said. And then right here in all capitals, don't check all the intervals. Like, do what we just did. It works great. It's way faster. It's less stressful. Identify the chord, and then just check the stuff. Okay, cool. So moving on. I don't want to beat a dead horse. So we say up next is unequal parallels. Okay, so you remember when I said, if it's a third, a minor third, or a major third, just call it a third. Parallel motion either way. But in this case, because for example, if we went, this is a third, it's a major third part. That is a minor third. And so we say, oh, but they're thirds. They're playing the role of thirds moving along in the key of C major. So we call them parallel. We don't measure the exact interval each part is moving. But here we kind of care a bit more. And it's specifically in the case of a diminished fifth, which is a form of the tritone. And so if we listen to the tritone, it's kind of dissonant. It's not got the same ring as a fifth. It's very, very dissonant. So we might be saying the tritone unequal fifths, that should be okay. And this is where we run into a bunch of opinions. But I've seen a general consensus for the most part. Most books abide by this rule. And that is, yes, this is a very dissonant interval. And so it's okay. But only okay sometimes. Because it's still a fifth. And so fives are just suspects, man. And so what we say is a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth is fine. So here we have a perfect fifth. And we're going to a diminished fifth, right? Or, it has to be a motion. So they move. So a perfect fifth. And then we go to a diminished fifth. Right? They have to move. We're cool with that. And the reasoning is, I think I explain it in here as well. But the reasoning is, here we have our unification, right? And then we go to something that is very dissonant, a diminished fifth. It's so dissonant that it's fine. But if we go from a dissonance into a consonance, so we go from this fifth, we don't like that. I mean this. It's too close to the sound of a perfect fifth. And so, as the sound of a parallel fifth. And so we discourage that. So if we go from a diminished fifth into a perfect fifth, it's like we're bringing the parts together in a way that's too closely related. So generally we don't like that. So diminished fifth into perfect fifth. But it gets even more complicated. It occurs only when it's between the bass. And I might be going, this is getting there's so many details here. So to back out and to think about this, whenever the bass in another voice So any of the other voices, if you have 4 parts, you have 3 other voices that this could happen to. Whenever that forms a diminished fifth with something, and it goes to a perfect fifth, it's not allowed. That's it. That's the one thing you need to remember. The bass and another voice form a diminished fifth, and they go to a perfect fifth, not allowed. And the reason is, it actually makes sense if you really think about it. The reason is the bass is the thing that defines our inversion. It has extreme power over the sound of our chord, our voicing. And so this voice can easily overpower another voice because of its prominent role. Therefore, we are extra cautious about our bass. This can actually happen in the inner voices. It can happen in any of these here upper voices, and we don't care. But if it happens down here between our bass and another part, we care a lot. So we'll check our bass. So basically, we just added another step to our objectionable parallels. We just said, okay, first we see, do I have fifths? So here I'm working with, I've got a B, a G, a D, and an F. And so I think, okay, I am working with some sort of a B diminished chord, right? And so I say, well, B diminished is going to have a diminished fifth, right? So I look at this, I say, well, the fifth from B is F sharp, a diminished fifth is F. So I say, do I have an F somewhere? And I say, I have it in my top voice. This is like the worst possible scenario, by the way, because now we are confusing our melodic and bass counterpoint, our melody and our thing that defines our inversion. So this is an extra big no-no. And we say, okay, this forms a fifth. So we're paying very close attention to this one. And we say, where does it go? Well, it goes from an A. So this comes down to an A and this goes to an E. And so now we say, crap, that's an extra bad no, because an A to an E is a perfect fifth. So the bass will overcome our melody. See, it's just, ew. This one has a sound to it that it does just sound wrong. You might think it's cool for a lot of other reasons, but for tonal harmony, not cool. So what I do, I just add on an extra thing. If I ever see the bass form a fifth, I want to make sure. Now, if it was a perfect fifth, if this was like an F sharp, and now it would be parallel fifth, so we still have a problem. But I could change this. I could change the E to be something else, right? Make it an F or something. Maybe I keep the voice static. I don't know. I make it something else. Then we're fine again. Or if I were to change it so that this was a perfect fifth and this went to a diminished fifth, then that's cool too, because we were going from perfect to diminished. We're tearing our voices apart. And it only matters in the bass. So yeah, there you go. There's the unequal fifth dealio. So basically look for the bass, check for it, make sure if there's a fifth, any kind of a fifth, it's not okay. But if you see a fifth in the inner voices and it's a diminished fifth, we're cool, we're fine. So I've seen this come up in class, and I've even seen cases where we even dismiss the bass case. Generally, this one's considered not okay, just generally. But if it's like the bass in a middle voice, there could be other things at play that we'll talk about later, like tendency tones and stuff. And so we might even consider it okay. But yeah, I've seen a lot of students get overwhelmed by this rule. But if you just check the extra bass for fifth, if you see a fifth in the bass, be extra careful. And so I say, okay. So now this is a whole to add to our checklist deal. Finally, we have direct and hidden eighths. And the name is going to become very clear. So we just learned up here, well, not learned, we've actually known this for some time, but we're giving more importance to it. Our lowest voice and our highest voice, which is usually soprano and bass, but sometimes, we don't have a tenor or an alto or whatever it is. So we call them the outer voices instead. We call them outer because maybe we don't have a conventional, regular setup. Maybe it's a 3-part texture or something. So whenever these two voices, if we have rules for them, because they play an extra important role. One's our melody, one is our inversions. So they're very important to us. So we say direct fifths. And the way it occurs is if they start at, okay, so this one's like a little tricky to catch. And this is another thing, we just check the bass extra carefully. If we start out, or there actually isn't really a starting requirement. If our soprano leaps So we see here our soprano is leaping, right? It leaps down to an E. And it leaps to form a fifth. It has to leap in the same direction too. So if it leaps in the same direction to form a fifth with our bass or an octave. So here it forms an octave instead, right? That is a direct fifth or a direct octave. You can imagine also why it's called hidden too. They're generally, if you're not watching out, they can get past you. Because if it's stepwise, we don't care. And if it's contrary, we don't care. It's similar motion. And the thing that's tricky about this one is this could be any interval. It might not be a fifth. It could be anything. It could be a second, and it leaps to form a fifth or an octave. Then we have a problem because the oral effect, meaning the way it sounds, is similar to a perfect fifth or a perfect octave, or not perfect. It's similar to parallel fifths and octaves. If I play it, we got that same sound. This one's more severe, as you can hear. But we go from A to E, and it just leaps there. And so these are generally harder to catch. The sound sometimes is less severe. And these intervals are fine in inner voices. And the reason is the inner voices don't define all that other stuff. Doesn't define the melody in the inversions. It's the bass melody counterpoint that we care so much about. And so if our voice, our melody leaps to form a fifth with the bass, that's a problem. So now we've got this. Now we say, and it has to leap in the same direction. So if our melody was to instead leap up and it was to form some other interval, like even if it was to leap up to an A, they say these are an octave. That's true. However, it's gone in contrary motion and it's stepwise. So this is actually totally fine. We're totally cool with something like that. But this, not cool at all. So hopefully I've explained this in a way. I'm trying to be as clear and plain as possible. So what I do on my checklist is I say, okay, I check, do I have parallel fifths? Do I have octaves anywhere? And I name my chord and I see, do I have fifths or octaves? If I notice one in the bass, the first thing I do is I check for unequal fifths. Then I say, okay, it's not an unequal fifth or whatever. But let's say I see a fifth in the bass. I also now check to see, is it between my soprano and my bass? If it's not, I'm fine. If it is, I'm sorry, my eyes are like bothering me right now. Okay. I don't know what it is in the air or something. But if it is a fifth, then I say, all right, it forms a fifth between my soprano and my bass. Does the soprano leap? I mean, it's like the last thing you have to check. And usually you don't have to worry about it. But if it leaps and it leaps in the same direction, you got to change something. If it leaps contrary, you're fine. And the same thing goes for the octaves. So you check for octaves and fifths. So basically just be really careful with your bass. And that's it. So my checklist simplified is check for fifths. Check for eighths. Does stuff happen with your bass? If it does it fulfill these requirements? That's like the simplified version. So I don't stress it too much when I'm looking. Okay. And that's that. And then over here I say, I know this can seem really overwhelming. It seems like there's like so many things. But remember, we check for fifths, octaves. If it's a fifth with our bass, did our soprano leap in the same direction? Is our soprano even moving in the same direction? And it has to be a leap. If it's stepwise, we're fine. That's why we generally want to encourage stepwise motion. If our melody moves stepwise, we're safe. We don't even have to check for this. So so this is like ways of speeding up your thought process. So we say, okay, cool. We do have a fifth, but it's stepwise. Or, oh no, we have a fifth, but our melody, our harmony, our soprano line leaps down in the same direction as our bass. We got to change something. Or maybe, but it's in the inner voices and it's a diminished fifth going to, in this case, if it's in the inner voices, as long as it's not parallel, we don't care. But if it's a bass and it forms a fifth, but it's a diminished fifth going to a perfect fifth, then we say, oh crap, we got to change something. So only really two additional conditions. If our soprano leaps in the same direction as the bass, forming a fifth or an octave, or if any voice forms a fifth or an octave with the bass and that fifth or octave goes from diminished to perfect. So anyways, okay, that's all the stuff. That's literally it. So I got a couple other things I want to tell you. The first one is instrumental music is generally less strict with almost all of these rules. And the reason is there could be tonal colors to take into account. There's just a lot of extra things. Maybe, that instrument is known for that particular interval. There's just things that come up. And they're covered as is necessary as we move forward. So generally, these rules will hold with what we're dealing with. But in instrumental music, the rules are just generally less strict. Also, if you're working in a texture, I didn't write an example. Oh yeah, here's an example. If I'm working in a texture, all these notes can be treated. I'm just spreading a chord out, right? This is a C minor chord. If I jump from a C minor chord and one of these voices leaps over here and forms we treat this as if it was just a C major chord on a whole note. If you were to reduce it in a score to something simpler, that's what we would reduce it to. And over here, this would be a C sharp major, except for I did some inharmonic spelling. Basically, it would be a C sharp major chord. And so we actually wouldn't have very much to worry about in this case. But if one of these voices formed a relationship that is parallel with one of these, because it's a moving texture, if we were to reduce it, it wouldn't be moving. And so we consider that poor as well. But again, this is also piano. Piano is known for stuff like this, so it's less big of a deal. And you also have to consider it with your melody. So things can get substantially more complicated. A lot of this will be easier as we move forward. I just want to give you some indication of things to come. And if you see things like this, you can consider that. If you didn't totally understand what I just said, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it more as time moves on. You'll see examples of it pointed out. And yes, and also exceptions to the bass and melody are very rare in instrumental music as well, because of the prominent role they both play. But inner voices become a lot less strict. And then we also say in instrumental music. And then also I wanted to point this out here because I haven't really said it yet. If you see parentheses around a note, that just means it's a non-chord tone. So if you see parentheses, non-chord tone, don't worry about it very much at this point in time. We'll talk about non-chord tones in harmony too. If you have any questions about this, let me know. If you have anything you want to add, if you saw something that looked kind of funny, you want to mention. So let me, just go ahead and leave a comment. I know it's a confusing subject. We will have some exercise with this. And as you write more and more harmonies, this will become so easy to you. It'll make way more sense. Subscribe and have a blessed day.